Well, hello, and welcome back to the Patristica YouTube channel. Today, I'm joined by my co-host, Markus and by two brilliant guests, Morwenna Ludlow and Ulrich Volp. As always, please remember to subscribe to the Patristica YouTube channel. It really helps us out, and don't forget to like and comment as well. In our last video, we covered a great titan of the early church, namely Saint Jerome. And today we're going to look at another titanic figure. But before we get into that, perhaps Morwenna and Ulrich, you can introduce yourselves to the Patristica community. Ulrich, why don't you go first?
Well, I'm professor for church history, history of theology, history of Christianity at Mainz University, and this is actually where we are at this very moment. I've been in this position for the past 17 years or so, and I feel privileged that my colleague from Exeter, Morwenna Ludlow, has joined our little patristic center here in Mainz.
And yes, it's been a great pleasure to be here for 6 months. I'm just coming to the end of my stay, and I will be returning to Exeter, where I'm Professor of Christian History and Theology.
That's fantastic. It's great to have a fellow country person on the channel. We don't get a lot of English scholars, so it's nice to have one of us here. And today, our great titan, Gregory of Nyssa. And this is all coming about because of the great work that our two colleagues are doing on Gregory. And perhaps, Morwenna, you could just maybe introduce to us the figure of Gregory before we get into some of the details about what you're up to with him at the moment. Because I think a lot of our viewers are very much involved in the 2nd century and the 3rd century because of what we do with the channel. You know, they know characters such as Ignatius and Marcion and Polycarp and all these guys, but Gregory is quite a leap forward for Patristica. And so perhaps you could just tell us a little bit about him and why he's important and the milieu within which he finds himself.
Yes, so Gregory lived and worked in the 4th century. So he was a bishop at the time when the Roman Empire had for several decades tolerated Christianity. He's working post the conversion of Emperor Constantine. Many people are remembering this year the anniversary, the 1700th anniversary of the Council of Nicaea and the formation of the Nicene Creed. And Gregory of Nyssa, together with his brother Basil and his friend Gregory of Nazianzus, were 3 theologians who defended the Nicene Creed when it had become rather controversial several decades after Nicaea, and was one of the theologians responsible for reaffirming the importance of the Nicene Creed at the Council of Constantinople in 381. So if you were an undergraduate theologian, you would probably come across Gregory of Nyssa in courses about early Christian doctrine, the doctrine of the Trinity in particular, but also he was working on questions like, who was Jesus Christ? How can we say that Jesus was both human and divine?
May I just add a couple of observations? I mean, why is Gregory particularly interesting? I mean, Morwenna already hinted at the fact that he's part of a very powerful intellectual network at the time. He certainly was in the front row, or I guess in the beginning, in the second row, a little bit, during the great doctrinal decisions in the context of the Council of Constantinople. But out of this group, I think he's probably the most original thinker in some respects. Because of his involvement in the councils, he was deemed to be orthodox, even in later times, although when you look at some of the texts, I think you might be excused if you put some question marks about the orthodoxy in one or two thoughts he'd had. But anyhow, he's a very original thinker. He's fantastic with the language. Both Morwenna and I have worked on different texts by Gregory, and I think we both agree that this is one of the joys of working with Gregory. His sentences can be rather long,
but also very beautiful, and his range of expression and his the literary modes in which he writes are very striking and creative, which makes him a really valuable and memorable person to work with.
And his thinking is actually rather concise. So you have these long sentences, but the way he elaborates his thoughts is actually not chaotic or it's concise, precise, straight to the point. And this is the reason why his works have been preserved in a pretty good state. Actually, I mean, the numbers of manuscripts, we're going to talk about the Anima ad Resurrectione, so we're talking about almost 100 manuscripts, which is a lot, for patristic text. Some other texts, like the canonical epistle, has, I think, 140 manuscripts surviving. So his contemporaries or the later Byzantine tradition, they loved him. Obviously, which is I think another reason why he's one of the titans of the golden age of patristic thought.
I think that's really interesting, because I think one of the things that immediately, when I first learned about Gregory, is that group that you mentioned that he's a part of with his brother and his friend. There's something quite attractive about his story, even without getting into his literature, that you've got this sort of little group of people who are working so hard and then would produce so much of what mainstream Christianity would then believe over the next millennia. So you mentioned there the text that you're particularly working on, and you mentioned the Latin name, but On the Soul and the Resurrection, for those of our viewers at home who don't have much Latin. Can you just give us a brief overview of this text? What's he getting at here? Obviously, it's on the soul and the resurrection. That's fine, but what's the main purpose of the text? Why does he write it? What's he talking about? And what's his sort of purpose for it?
Do you want to make a start?
Okay. Yeah, well, first of all, it's a dialogue. So it's not a doctrinal treatise on the resurrection, but it's a dialogue. It's actually a very interesting and beautifully described scene. It starts with his travels. He meets his sister, Macrina, and it turns out that she's mortally ill at this very time. So they start talking about death and the immortality of the soul. Those of you who are trained in classical Greek literature, of course, recognize this as the general story of one of the dialogues by Plato. The Phaedo, it's exactly the same situation. The pupils of Socrates meet him at the night of his death, and they talk about the immortality of the soul. Gregory's dialogue is actually quite a bit longer than the original, and of course it's a Christian dialogue.
And the other really striking contrast with Plato's dialogue is that in Plato there is briefly a woman in the picture, but Plato describes how Socrates' wife Xanthippe is taken away in great distress. In Gregory's dialogue, the teacher, the Socrates figure, if you like, is a woman, Macrina. And Gregory is the person who starts the dialogue, weeping almost like a woman. And so there's a very interesting question about gender roles between teacher and pupil in this work. And throughout the text, Gregory refers to his sister not by her name, but in Greek as he didaskalos, the teacher. And this is a repeated and emphatic reference point throughout the text.
Isn't this not just one of the earliest teaching texts we know by a woman in early Christianity?
It's spectacular, yes, if that's what you mean.
Yeah. And we might talk later about what we know about Macrina as a historical person, but the decision to cast her as the lead dialogue partner here is really fantastic, very interesting.
And of course, it raises a lot of questions about the situation, about his readership. Were they expecting that? Was this scandalous? And of course, all these gender issues, which translate into a particular character of language also. So it's actually, it's really exciting just to read the Greek text of this dialogue. But you ask about the contents. there have been different suggestions how to structure the text. The original manuscript and also one of the reasons why we are discussing this is we now have finally a critical edition, which took about 100 years to produce because of this enormous manuscript tradition. And this was published by Brill, and but when you look at it, there is actually no structure given by the editors. In Byzantine times, there have been several attempts to structure the dialogue. Fairly complicated. These scribes sort of tried to find arguments, up to 96 different arguments. I think the easiest way is to structure it according to the 7 questions that this dialogue is elaborating on. First question is, what is death? Second question, what is the soul? Third question is, what are the different parts of the soul that are responsible for different things in human life? Fourth, what happens after death? 5, there's little excursus on the theory of the transmigration of souls. And then 6 and 7, how did the soul come into being? And 7, what does the Christian belief in the resurrection actually mean? These are the 7 questions that Gregory asks Macrina, and Macrina answers them with her immensely educated and learned background. Another exciting thing is when you read it, you have to read between the lines, and of course you discover Plato. That's very obvious, but there's in my view, there's a lot more Aristotle in it than Plato actually.
Yeah.
Some Stoic ideas and Christian exegesis.
Indeed. So there's some very interesting exegesis of the parable of the rich man and Lazarus and the parable of the wheat and the tares. So all the way through, Macrina seems to be arguing that you need both reason and scripture in order to answer these questions. But I think the fact that Ulrich has structured the treatise around a series of questions is significant, because Gregory presents this text to the reader not as a dogmatic treatise, as, you know, this is the case, and this is the case, and this is the case, but because it's a dialogue, it's presented precisely as this, as a series of questions. And I think one of the points of the dialogue form is that Gregory is trying to answer the kind of questions that he knows his readership might themselves have. He's a priest, a bishop who has pastoral experience. He knows that when faced with death, people have these kinds of questions, and I think the fact that it's structured around questions rather than answers, if you like, is a significant explanation for why it's a dialogue form. Gregory's leading the reader with him.
And surprisingly or not, I think these are exactly the same questions we still have today, 17 centuries later.
Yeah.
Or a lot of us, I think, have this question. Yeah.
And we know that Plato's dialogue, Phaedo, was regarded in Gregory's own day as a consolatory document. You know, it's not a piece of abstract philosophy. It was a dialogue that students were told to go and read in times of grief. And I think Gregory is thinking, well, what can I provide as a bishop for congregations, or perhaps for priests, to help them think around how to deal with the pastoral experience of grief in their working lives.
What I find most fascinating with the text, of course, is he is not just asking a question or asking those questions which we still have today, but he stages himself as the hyper skeptical, isn't it? He approaches the whole thing. Well, you have said about, he is shedding tears, but then he poses himself, and it becomes clearer and clearer through the text, of course, that he is really just taking the view in order to ask and address questions as a most skeptical person, right? Doesn't believe anything, doesn't believe in the soul, in the aftermath of death, and bursts out with these questions. And poor Macrina is being displayed as the one who has to fight off his brother, right?
Yes, although there are some points where Gregory, I think, is playing the skeptic because it drives the conversation further, and we don't really believe profoundly in his skepticism. There are other points at which I think he is genuinely, expressing bewilderment. So it's not so much a radical skepticism, but perhaps an emotionally driven, not knowing what to know, or not knowing where to turn. And I think that the two of those working together is a very interesting dynamic in the dialogue.
Maybe one additional detail which I think is important. I think, well, he poses as someone who's quite skeptical of scripture, but can be convinced by reason and a logical argument. And basically what Macrina is doing is that she shows that scripture is actually reasonable.
If you read it in a reasonable way.
Exactly.
Yes.
Yeah.
But I think rhetorically, I think it's extremely clever that what you were just saying, Morwenna, that he poses just to be a skeptical. But that only is being revealed about a third into the text. So the first third, when you read the text as it is, right, you think, hey, he is as probably even more skeptical and critical than I would be. And only then, once you are taken on board, right, then the literary device shows that it's staged and posed, and probably he's less skeptical than he sounded at first.
And I think philosophically speaking, what's happening there is that between the two of them, they're kind of using questions to strip all one's preconceptions away until you get almost to nothing, and then you build it up again. Yeah. Exactly.
As the resident non-Gregory person in the room, I think one of the questions that maybe our viewers would have is back to this Macrina. To what extent, you've said there that Gregory writes and Gregory does, to what extent are these words being put onto her? Or to what extent do you think that she may have actually had some of these ideas in her head and she was talking about them with her friends and brothers? Is it her, or is it Gregory's putting it onto her, do you think, that's going on in the text?
Yeah, I mean, that's the $1 million question. So thank you for asking it. So one of what we do know about Macrina only comes from the pen of her brother Gregory, historically speaking. We have another text that he wrote on the life of Macrina, which is an account of her life, but also of her death. So we have these two texts, which are both centered around Macrina's dying, interestingly. In the life of Macrina, Gregory visits her, describes the deathbed scene, and then her burial and funeral. And in the course of that text, he does give us some more biographical details, including the fact that she was the oldest sibling out of 10, which always makes me think hats off to her mother, Amelia. As the oldest sibling, she had a role in giving a kind of spiritual formation to her other siblings, including Gregory and Basil. She ended up becoming, in effect, a nun. She dedicated her life to a single life dedicated to God, dedicated to prayer. She turned her own household with her mother into what we would call a nunnery. But in later life, that developed so that she was abbess over a community of both men and women. The communities lived in separate living quarters, but worshipped together in the same church. So we know that she was capable of leadership. She, throughout the life of Macrina, is described as someone who has a constant consolatory role. So the family goes through a series of bereavements. And in each case, it's Macrina who is described by Gregory as being the one who consoles those around her and being strengthened by her own faith. So in a sense, what she's doing in the soul and the resurrection dialogue is to sort of pick up that consolatory role, but in a more determined philosophical vein. And whether or not she could argue in precisely the way that Gregory describes her as doing, my own feeling is that this consolatory role of being a strong spiritual pastor in times of acute grief, that I think surely is true to her character. As for what she knew philosophically, it's very difficult to tell, because we don't even know what Gregory had on his own library shelves. We have to work it out from how he writes, and because we don't have anything from Macrina's own pen, it's very difficult to tell.
There's actually a third source. Not many people know that. There's an early letter by Gregory,
yes,
Epistola 19, where he gives a short summary of her character and her life. So I don't think there can be any doubt that she's a historical person, that she's achieved something notable with that community. I also think there can be no doubt that she was a learned person to some extent, and a figure Gregory looked up to. I think all these are fairly reliable historical facts. But of course, then Gregory turns her into a literary figure in two very different ways. I mean, the Vita, the life of Macrina, is actually quite different. It's, I mean, one of the most beautiful scenes in ancient Greek literature is the deathbed scene in the life of Macrina. And there's the prayer, the very last prayer she utters before she closes her eyes. It's an entire page. It's almost a kitsch scene. The sun is going down, and this is the end of her life. The dialogue on the soul and the resurrection is completely different. There she's a philosopher. She's the Socrates of the 4th century.
And just before we move on to the text, does she die as an old woman? Is it a tragic death? Is it unexpected? Do we know anything about that, the circumstances there?
If I remember rightly, she was probably about my age, so in her 50s. So it's neither a tragically young death, but nor is she in great old age either. So she's reached a position where she's an established leader and teacher in her own community. But she dies shortly after the second oldest sibling, Basil. So what you see going through Gregory's life experience is the experience of being the oldest member of the family who's left. He's losing his older siblings.
I mean, she dies of some mortal illness. There's some medical assistance at hand, which is quite interesting, because she uses the way a doctor would analyze and diagnose and heal as an example on how the human mind and the human body work together. So it gives one quite an interesting view into the situation of a mortally ill person,
who had the wealth to pay for a doctor.
Exactly.
And I think this is one of the issues that it might be worth reminding your viewers of, which is that Gregory and Macrina came from a wealthy aristocratic family. So they had the money to be educated, and we know in this period that women in that kind of social rank often were highly educated. What they could do with their education is another question, but they had the means, and they often heightened their educational opportunities by being in correspondence with educated friends of their brothers.
I think that's really interesting, because, again, coming as someone who just did an undergraduate and a master's and came through these figures, as part of one module rather than in any way in any great depth. We all know Gregory, we all know Basil, we all know other Gregory, but yet she's relatively passed over, I think, in some of these modules. I'm sure she isn't in your modules, but in the places where I was, sorry, Markus actually taught me in my masters. I shouldn't say that he's here. I think she's relatively passed. I think she's relatively passed over. So let's get into the text then on the soul and the resurrection. And you mentioned that maybe dividing this text is difficult, but there are perhaps 7 questions, and I think they're questions, like you say, that are still being asked today in many ways, and are causing big arguments. I was just watching earlier some new video with Richard Swinburne, the great English philosopher, about the soul. What is the soul? Where does the soul go? What does the soul do? And we have this exact same question, similar questions being asked all the way back. And so perhaps we begin there with the soul. What's going on with Gregory? And is he innovative? Is he bringing up new, or well, either him or his sister, is he bringing up new ideas, reiterating what's already been said, confirming it, elaborating? How do you see him? Is he a great inventor, or is he more just the stealer of ideas that are reformulated?
I think you have a...
Yeah, well, the dialogue, of course, is established on the basis that it's common sense that a human being consists of a body, on the one hand, and a soul, or a non-bodily part on the other hand, which is something intellectuals in antiquity on the whole agreed on, and that many of us still have that anthropology and would agree on that sort of basic and anthropological common sense is, I think, in many respects inherited, from an antiquity. I don't think it's necessary that we think in terms of soul and body and anthropologically. I mean, some cultures don't. Yeah, but the fact that in Western culture, certainly in the UK and in the US and in Germany, most people on the street would agree that there is something like the soul and the body division in human nature, and this is just inherited from the intellectual history of antiquity, of which Gregory and Macrina are part of.
Yeah. And they, towards the beginning of the dialogue, they both come to an agreement that the people with whom they profoundly disagree are those Greek philosophers, such as the Epicureans, who deny the sort of existence of a non-material soul altogether. So they kind of start off by saying, okay, well, we're agreed to disagree with them. So they're ruling out that possibility very, very early on. But that means that by definition, therefore, their views are in some continuity with earlier Greek philosophy.
So there's no dispute on the fact that a human being has a soul, that this soul is somehow immortal, that this soul is somehow different from the body. But there are lots of other questions left if you agree on that. For example, when does the existence of the soul begin? At the very same moment as the body comes into existence, or later, or earlier? Is there a pre-existence of the soul? These are the questions that are being discussed. Macrina is surprisingly firm, and has a very clear point of view. In this particular question, soul and body are being created by God at the very one moment in time. And this is actually one of the arguments that make it plausible that there is a God who acts as the creator. And this God creates a human being as a human being consisting of body and soul at one moment in time. Then, of course, the body, which I think is quite obvious to quite easy to observe. That then, of course, the body is open to decay and death, but the soul isn't.
But is that not exactly the opening of that tract? And I'm not sure whether you are not jumping too quickly into the positive statements, because what I find with this writing so attractive is it's a physical environment that's being displayed and it's staged maybe, but it is the experience of Gregory seeing not only that he has just experienced the death of his brother, but seeing his beloved sister decaying. I mean, literally decaying in front of him. And he takes that to seriously question, I think, at least in the beginning, that everything now goes. So he's losing everything. He has lost his brother. He's now about to lose his sister. And he asked the question which probably we all ask when we see that our most beloved partner or friend is in the sight of ourselves decaying and going. So the question is, what is there left to hang on? And it is interesting that in the text, Macrina says to him, well, are you afraid? And now it's not afraid that my life ends, or it's not whether or not you believe in the soul, but the major scarcity is, are you afraid of the insecurity of that you haven't got an answer and you have nothing to hold on? And of course, in the beginning, I thought, when she then comes up with whole debate about the soul, it's the least thing you would have thought that's something you can hang on, right? Because it's as nebulous, until the end of the text, is as nebulous as anything. So it's not physical, it's not tangible. And I think that the text has a long way how to dispute his anxiety of letting go what he's hanging on, because it becomes clear the soul is nothing you can hang on anyway. So you have to make a big leap, and what the text is asking us for. So just my plea, take us a bit more through and not jump too quickly to the resurrection at the end.
I think that's very true. And in Gregory's other texts, there are other scenes where he describes the experience of being in the presence of a dead body, and it might seem rather a kind of a morbid fascination of his, but I think it's genuinely a genuinely human reaction to the presence of death and not knowing what lies beyond. So he does describe, Gregory, the dialogue partner, does describe in some detail that experience in this dialogue. But one of the things that it provokes in Macrina is this series of analogies where she points out that even when human beings are thinking about the material world around them, they use their senses to reason towards something that they can't see. So one of the examples is a doctor who might put their hand on a pulse, or in other ways use their eyes perhaps to diagnose a problem that lies underneath the human skin. They're using their senses to reason towards something which they can't see. And then another example Macrina uses is that of a vacuum. So it was a philosophical problem in antiquity. Does a vacuum exist? But Macrina shows that a vase contains not an absolute vacuum, but a bubble of air, in fact, because if you take an amphora and place it in a body of water, then the air will come out of the vase, and Gregory describes the noise that it will make, blub, 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 coming out through the water into the air. And Macrina says, well, that shows that there is something there that you can't see, you can't touch it, you can't feel it. And yet, through our reason, through this experiment, we can see there is something else there. And the soul is not analogous to those bubbles coming through the water, which are material, but Macrina is gradually in this through this method, I suppose in a way distracting him with very practical everyday examples to gradually lead him to a process of reasoning whereby he can understand that although we can't see or touch or smell the soul, there are ways in which we can reason towards it.
And maybe just one more example. I mean, the look of a dead body, as horrifying as it is, for Macrina is proof that there must have been something within that body before death.
Yeah.
And for everybody who's known a living person and then sees the body of that deceased person, for someone like that, it's clear that something has changed, and something has left the body. So that's also, I think, quite a good argument to make for the soul as being different from the body.
Yeah, indeed.
Yeah, I think that's quite poignant, actually. I worked for a long time in care homes, and there is, as you say, that moment where someone dies and it just shifts. And I think the English word animation, right, from the word, that animation goes, and something is fundamentally changed. And it's so beautiful, I think, in many ways, that, again, people have asked the same or similar sorts of questions, and we're not just ask them in the 21st century in isolation. These are the thoughts of people for throughout all of time, I'm sure. One of the things that you mentioned in an email before to me is the use, as you alluded to there, of metaphors, parables, and things like that. And I'm just wondering to what extent, again, I'm not particularly familiar with the text, but to what extent these things are used either to help the reader or / the interlocutor within the text. And I think obviously everyone who watches this channel will know the parables of Jesus, I'm sure, and the way that we use metaphor in other early Christian texts. But does the text employ these for a particular reason, either to help the interlocutor Gregory in the text or to help the external reader? And can you think of any good examples of where these sorts of things are used to aid us?
Well, I think it achieves different objectives. I mean, one is that it creates this classroom situation between the teacher and the pupil. I mean, you know that from university lectures, the difference of a university lecture and a textbook is that the lecturer gives you examples in order to explain things. And this is exactly the method that Macrina is employing here. Apart from the fact that they're actually quite catchy examples.
Yeah, and I think some of them are very visual examples as well. And Gregory was a real expert in this Greek rhetorical technique of really precise descriptions of vivid scenes. And the reason for doing that is not to give people a rest from all this complicated philosophical dialogue, but rather to present an argument in a slightly different mode, to really capture the reader's or the audience's imagination, and to lead them through the process of thinking as Gregory himself presents himself as thinking. So if I could use the example of the theatrical machine. So she starts off with this example of air in an amphora that you can see bubbling up through the water if you place it in a deeper body of water. And then she points out that people have created more complicated machines which use precisely the fact that captured air can have an effect. And what she's describing, I think, is not a water organ as it is sometimes described in translations, but rather an automaton. So Greek mechanical engineers created automata of various kinds, some of which had moving parts, but others of them used a combination of captured air and water to make sounds. So, for example, you might pour water into a device, and then the air which is expelled through a pipe might make a sound like a recorder. And sometimes they would have birds that would make a noise like this. Occasionally, so we're told, they had automata that were designed to look more like human beings. And so she moves from this example of an amphora with captured air making a noise to an automaton that makes a noise through the movement of water and air. And she says, well, if you saw one of those automata, you wouldn't think that it had just come about spontaneously. You would assume that it must have been made by a skilled maker. And then she says, well, just as when you look at a human being that moves and talks all by itself, you don't think that just occurred spontaneously. It must too have the maker. And so she moves from this quite simple example of the amphora with the captured air to actually then talk about God, the creator, reasoning from creation to an intelligent mind that lies behind it. And I think the process by which she does that very gradually through these very visual metaphors is extremely clever.
Interesting. I mean, it's a 17th century argument.
Yeah.
The watchmaker parable, which had been popular in early modern theology. But it's also a very interesting passage because, I mean, we discussed this last year again, actually. It shows that it's actually worth looking at the text and translating it oneself, because older translations just write water organ. And Morwenna convinced me that there's actually nothing in the text to suggest that he means a water organ.
There's nothing to suggest it means a musical instrument, but the fact that it might be an automaton that mimics a living animal or human being makes so much more sense of her
Absolutely.
argument.
Yeah, I'm totally convinced.
But she also uses we've talked there about an example from the life around one. She also has very visual descriptions of parables as well. So we might talk about the parable of the rich man and Lazarus, perhaps.
It's Luke 16.
Yes. So having led Gregory to the point where he is more or less accepting that there is an immortal, immaterial soul, you can kind of almost hear the cogs going around his head, and he thinks, okay, so where is that after death? Because in Luke 16, Jesus says that after he dies, the poor man goes up to heaven and is in Abraham's bosom, on Abraham's lap, as it were. And the rich man who ignored him is in another location, separated from him by a chasm. So Gregory thinks, well, this must mean that somehow the soul is not immaterial, that it can occupy a location. So this is one of the questions that he poses to Macrina, where does the soul go after death? But we only get there because between them they have kind of revoiced Jesus's parable in very vivid visual terms, which then Macrina seeks to interpret.
And of course, one of the points the parable makes is that the rich man is in pain. Yeah. So that's another question: how can the soul experience pain? And I mean, what does that mean? And again, Macrina has a very straightforward answer to that. I mean, Gregory, I think, believed in the concept that we, for example, meet with Origin in 3rd century, that basically all human beings are part of some sort of resurrection. There's a lot of debate whether Gregory actually accepted the apokatastasis theory of the 3rd century or not. Yeah, the scholarship is actually divided upon this issue. And it also shows.
Explain for the ordinary viewer what apokatastasis is.
In the manuscript tradition, it basically means it doesn't matter whether you've been a good human being or a bad human being, you are going to be part of the resurrection.
We might call it universal salvation, basically, in modern Englishy terms.
I guess. And of course, Luke 16 could be used as an argument against this, because the rich person or the soul of the rich person seems to be in pain. And for Macrina, it's quite easy. I mean, the difference between the soul of the poor person who's suffered a lot in his life is that this soul is not attached to life at all. I mean, it's been a very bad and unpleasant life. So the soul is actually happy to have left this earthly existence. Whereas the life of the rich man, that's the difference between the rich and the poor. The life of the rich man had been very pleasant. Yeah, so he doesn't want to leave this pleasant life of wealth and luxury. So the process of leaving that life has to be extremely painful, for the rich person. And then, of course, Gregory connects that with the concept of virtue, which is, I think, very fundamental for Gregory. I mean, I'm always interested in the ethics of it, but in this context, it just means if you already have a sort of fairly detached view on earthly life, then it's much easier to leave that life.
Yeah, exactly. And so this idea of a painful leaving of life for those who are sinful, spiritually painful, Gregory generalizes from that particular example of the rich man, or the voice of Macrina in the dialogue generalizes it and suggests that this painful process of purification will happen to all souls who've not reached the requisite level of virtue, which allows them to sort of leave life in a more detached way. And I also think the key word here is eventually. So I'm one of those scholars who think that Gregory does think that in the end all people will be saved, but it is in the end, and eventually it will take them possibly many long periods of purification for their soul to reach that point at which they will finally be purified enough to enjoy life with God.
When this question comes up at the Second Council of Constantinople in 553, does Gregory get lumped in at all into this Origenist issue of universal salvation, or is he sort of not put into that category? Does he get overlooked?
He's not mentioned in that council. There are some points in his manuscript tradition where some of the more controversial points around this area are in some manuscripts and not in others. And so scholars have argued whether they've been put in or taken out. I think probably they were in, and they might have been edited out so that he would escape that kind of censure. But it's fairly clear to me from things that he says in other texts, like his commentary on the Song of Songs, that he thinks that in the end all rational souls will be saved, and this view of his is picked up by, for example, Maximus the Confessor.
Well, that's actually one of the reasons why it's so wonderful to have a proper critical edition now with the entire manuscript edition in there. I mean, those of you who work with patristic texts might know this huge series by Jean-Paul Mignet, a 19th century publisher, and his edition or publication of this dialogue simply uses a text that's been sanitized, as my colleague Eckhard Mühlenberg said, sanitized, and it's especially with reference to these passages. Yeah, so it does make a difference.
Yeah.
What edition and manuscript tradition you use for your scholarly work.
Let me tell you, the Patristica viewers will be well and truly with you on this, because we talk at length about the manuscripts of Ignatius of Antioch, but also of the Marcionite tradition and the Marcionite New Testament texts, which have no manuscript. So they love a bit of manuscript chat on this channel. And on the subject of which, and again, they'll be able to empathise with you here. You mentioned, okay, there's this case of the sanitization, as you put it, which is a great phrase, actually, of how sometimes these scribes can manipulate things. Why, if we have a critical edition, and this is why we're here talking about this, did you feel the need for a new German translation? And are there any other challenges that went into this new process, apart from dealing with some of these sanitizations of the manuscripts?
Well, I mean, first of all, that a lot of joy was produced by translating this text, and I don't think one actually can get into the text, but without properly translating it. I mean, when you look at the French translations, the English translations, and the German translations, it's a particular situation because this is one of the most famous texts by a patristic author. So there are lots of translations. Actually, I have just to make this more visual. So this is a selection of translations already existing in French, English and German. All of these translations, of course, were translated from texts before the critical edition was published. So simply the existence of a proper critical edition, I think, is reason enough to attempt it anew. In English, the situation is actually not too bad. I mean, we've had quite a few translations in the 20th century. Mm-hmm. The last one coming out in 2008. There's one from the 1990s and a very interesting one from the 1960s. Whereas the only German translation that exists basically goes back to the mid-19th century. It's been sort of reworked and last published in the 1920s, so 100 years ago, on the basis of an edition that isn't up to today's standards. So I think to make a case for new German translation that's actually very easy to make. It's slightly more difficult in English. Interesting is also the French tradition of translating this text, because all the French translations we have, they're sort of a mix of an edition and a translation. So they actually create their own text because of the difficulties of the manuscript tradition and translate that, and makes the French translations quite difficult to use, actually, because you're not quite sure what is the actual text they're translating. So yeah, this alone, I think, justifies the publication of a new translation. There are lots of minor points in the manuscript tradition, sort of typical original mistakes introduced by one scribe early on, and then different attempts at healing these mistakes in the manuscript tradition. For example, there's one, I think, quite interesting instance where Macrina is referring to Plato openly. She uses the name Plato. Then she's referring to Aristotle without mentioning Aristotle, and then she's mentioning other groups of philosophers who have had ideas about the soul, or rather about the different parts of the soul that are responsible for different things. And in the text, in the Greek text, according to the beautiful work by Spira and Mühlenberg, who are responsible for the critical edition, the original version must have said that Macrina refers to different groups of philosophers who've expressed their views on the soul in prose or in any rhythm and meter. So there are three different groups. All the translations in existence were relying on a different text that would only have two groups, because of the difficulties in the manuscript. So if you're interested in the education and the background and the library behind this is actually not insignificant. And also, of course, the different, well, any translation follows different principles of interpretation and translating texts. So, I mean, I could go into the different philosophies of the different translations. Because Gregory's Greek is so different, especially from today's English, more so than today's German, I I think, especially the English translations are very, very far apart from the way they translate and interpret that text.
Yeah, I mean, Gregory's Greek is complex. His vocabulary is huge. So actually, both English and German have the advantage of a big vocabulary, and that helps when translating him.
That's a big disadvantage of the French, because they have a much more limited vocabulary.
What English tends to struggle with, though, is it has to make some adjectival phrases into huge, long, extra phrases in English, and it becomes all very unwieldy. And that means that you often have to break up sentences which are just one sentence in Gregory, but you have to put some pauses into English, and that breaks up his sequence of thought. Whereas you can have very long sentences of Gregory's Greek, which kind of just sort of flow on and on and on, and gradually build up his argument cumulatively. And I think German is much better suited in its structure to conveying that style and kind of rhetorical effect.
And also, I mean, we kind of have these very long nouns, which are very precise and very similar to the way Gregory conceptualizes things. And also just one minor thing. I mean, quite often Gregory uses an impersonal phrase, and in German, well, I mean, you can say in English, one does this or one would think so, but most modern translators try to avoid that, because I don't know, it sounds a bit dated,
over formal, perhaps.
Over formal. Whereas in Germany, it comes natural. Man tut etwas, one does something. So yes, I think the German translation will be much better than any English translation, because German is so much closer to the Greek.
Let me raise one question where I think the impressive books that you've shown also are hiding a fallacy for the readers, because I, as a scholar, started, of course, out from the 4th century. Not from Gregory directly, but from Apollinarius, one of the circles of the Cappadocians. And as Gregory, Apollinarius, of course, somebody who is very familiar with the idea of the resurrection. So when I was asked to give a paper on the resurrection in the 2nd century, I thought it's an easy job, because I had all these books in my mind, about the 4th century on the resurrection, on the soul, and so far. Just to discover that apparently in the 2nd century there is a very different discourse, very different questions, that the majority of Jews had no idea about the resurrection at all, let alone about Christ's resurrection. So I think there might be a danger in reading this text as if it's just a confirmation what most Christian people believed anyway. But I do think it is a genuine text in that sense, that still in the 4th century, not everybody, right from the beginning, who was a Christian or who wanted to become a Christian, or who was outside of Christianity, just from Roman backgrounds, naturally believed in a life after death. So in this respect, I think it is also an introductory text into what Christianity is about.
Well, it's original thinking, it's creative thinking, and I would make the same argument about the ethics in there. I mean, many people presume that, well, Christian ethics always existed in a similar way, or can be followed back to the New Testament. A lot of what we perceive as Christian ethics is the result of 4th century thinking. I firmly believe that.
And I think one of the issues that has attracted some of the most scholarship on this particular text is the role of the emotions and their connection to virtue, which is a profound interest to philosophers of ethics, and on which it's not clear that Macrina and Gregory come to an absolutely settled position. So Gregory starts off in this position of grief and fear and Macrina chides him and says, these are not really parts of the soul. You need to get rid of them. And he challenges her back and say, well, but some emotions surely are necessary, because some of the great New Old Testament prophets were angry with God, and sometimes desire leads us forward to good things, not just distracts us by bad things. And Macrina, in some places, seems to suggest that yes, perhaps emotions are a kind of a connector between the soul and the body, and allows us to train the human soul in a virtuous direction. In other places, she seems to think that these emotions must be got rid of, and the only thing in the end that will remain is a kind of purified love, and in this life, hope. So this question of exactly what emotions are, whether they're adjuncts to the soul or hinges between the soul and the body, what the philosophy of the emotions is a key point which remains ambiguous, I think, in this text,
Yes.
and which perhaps is an illustration of the way in which that question was by no means settled in Christian theology.
Yeah.
Wow. Thank you so much. And just finally, before we wrap up, when does all of your great work come out, and where can people find it? And perhaps when it does come out, we could put links down in the description below. When does it all come out, and where can we find it?
Well, my German translation and commentary is going to be published this year. So I'll send you the details as soon as it's out. It's already announced on the publisher's website, so I can send you the link for that.
Fantastic. Well, thank you so much to you both for joining us. Hopefully this has inspired people to go back and read Gregory, even if it is in the English, which, as we know, is subpar, and they can learn a little bit more about him through this episode. Again, just a reminder, please do subscribe to the channel. It helps us out so much. And when Ulrich does send me the links, I'll put them down in the description below for our German speakers. Until next time, bye-bye.